Hello listeners, trust you are doing great today. This is Amaget Radio Communication. I am Titilola Ogushona, your host, and I welcome you to the maiden edition of yet another intriguing, expository, informative, and enlightening program series titled Policies and Economic Development. It is the maiden edition. This program series will run throughout this quarter and will be investigating principles of effective policy formulation in achieving economic development in any nation. We'll be delving into the concept of economic growth and economic development. Why? You can't talk about economic development without first understanding what economic growth means. So we'll be delving into the concept of economic growth, the definition of economic growth, how do you measure economic growth in a country, in a particular nation, what are the drawbacks of measuring economic growth, the role of economic growth in a country, if we're comparing economic growth among various countries in this program series. Then, because the focus is on economic development, examining closely the concept of economic development, the difference between economic growth and economic development, we'll be discussing the indicators of economic development. We'll be examining the factors affecting economic development of a nation, examples of effective economic development programs that nations have deployed in the past, what nations can still continue to deploy. And remember, the program title is Policies and Economic Development. So we'll be going back to the definition of economic policies. What are economic policies? We have different kinds of policies. We have institutional policies. We have structural policies. But more focus will be on economic policies. We'll be looking at the definition of economic policies, the various types of economic policies, looking at the goals of economic policy, the importance of formulating these policies. What are the guidelines? What are the rudiments? What are the factors that should be considered in formulating economic policies so that they can achieve stated objectives in terms of economic development of a nation? Because it's important. You see that some nations, a lot of nations definitely will not be in the loop. They would have formulated a lot of economic policies. But the question is, have these policies been effective? Have they been able to achieve economic development for that particular country? So why do we have other countries, developed countries? Why do we have, them achieving economic development, consistent growth over the years? And we have some countries in a particular continent not really achieving the stated objective, not achieving those goals, the economic growth in that country. So we'll be looking at all of these factors, making comparison between countries that have gotten it right and countries or continents that are still struggling with achieving economic development in their countries. Subsequently, we'll be considering in various episodes issues peculiar to developing nations. We'll look at the different economic policies prevalent in this economy. We'll be analyzing how effective those policies have been in achieving stated environmental goals. We'll be examining the various bottlenecks inhibiting enjoying the expected gains of the economic policies. What we also plan to do is to deploy a unique or interesting strategy is to interview, get a sample size of people or firms that we expect to get gains from such policy to examine the effectiveness of the policy. So we want to get the people feedback. There are burning issues around the globe that we'll be considering in this program series, and one of them is poverty. Many nations and in fact continents are struggling with this, and thus economic development becomes quite challenging in achieving in such a nation or continent. The issue of any poverty is a global concern such that the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the Global Goals, in 2015. And it is a call to action with a focus to end poverty, protect the planet, ensure that by year 2030, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. The main goal of the SDG is to build a more equal, just, sustainable world for not just the present generation, but for future generations. We talk about poverty. The goals of the United Nations is a call to achieve these sustainable goals for not just that's why it's called sustainable, not just the present generation, but also the future generation, those even yet unborn. In fact, the focus of the SDGs, deployed by the United Nations, we call them the 5 P's. The focus is on people, the planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. So if when the United Nations is a global concern, ending poverty in all dimensions, in this program series, we'll be considering various dimensions of poverty, the effect of poverty, the policies that have been effective to end poverty in other nations, so that developing nations, other nations that are still struggling with poverty, would learn from it. And understanding statistics, if out of 19 out of the 20 poorest countries across the globe are situated in Africa, in the continent of Africa. Another issue that we'll be considering that is of importance is unemployment. We're looking at the factors affecting unemployment, the increase rate of unemployment among various nations, policies that various countries have adopted that have been effective, and policies that nations struggling with unemployment rate can also adopt in order to achieve reduction in this rate and attain economic development in such nations. In addition, we will look at the role of small, medium enterprises, popularly known as SMEs, their role in attaining economic development. We expect that the small, medium enterprises would act as catalysts for economic development in most nations, but realize in developing nations this has not been the case. So what are those factors responsible? Why have we not had the SMEs achieving that growth process the way we'd expect that they should have achieved? What are those bottlenecks that SMEs are struggling with? Definitely on this program, subsequent episodes, we're getting feedback across the various SME sectors. Okay, the sector of SMEs, various business owners, the firms. We're going to be interviewing them to see what the issues are. Is it finance? Okay, is it the issue of infrastructure? Is it the issue of level of literacy rate, skilled manpower? Whatever it is, we'll be investigating further on some episodes later in this program series. Of course, definitely we'll be looking at the financial market. We are going to be focusing because financial market is expected that's a place where both medium-term, long-term funds are raised, and most organizations, most firms will need capital, and this is a place where they can raise capital. And the financial market, we are talking about the money market and the capital market. So when you hear the issues of stocks, when we talk the issues of bonds, okay, we'll be doing all of those things. Okay, but the money market is a market that we'll be focusing on. Particularly, we're going to be zooming our lenses on the money market. Especially in developing countries, realize that the money market is still, I would say, underdeveloped. Okay, yes, if I'm right, if I'm wrong, definitely we'll be speaking to experts in this area to shed light on the bottlenecks. Why do we have money markets, in developing countries, still underdeveloped or not as developed as their contemporaries in developed nations? What are those specific bottlenecks? Is it peculiar to particular, continents? We'll be looking at all of this because the money market, there are a lot of instruments known now. We have the commercial papers, a lot of those instruments. Let's look at it critically and look at other policies that could help to develop the money market further, because the goal is we are talking about economic development and looking at those specific policies that has really helped other continents, other nations develop their money market, and look at it vis-a-vis developing nations. What lessons are there to be learned? What can we do in terms of formulating more effective policies that would help the money market, which is an arm of the financial market. And if time will permit, on this particular program series, we'll be looking at tax policies and its impact on economic development. Are those tax policies, inherent in various economies, have they been very effective in achieving economic development? Look at the role of infrastructural development on on economic development of various nations. And definitely another one that we like to look at is education literacy rates. In fact, the fourth sustainable development goal of the United Nations I've earlier mentioned is to achieve quality education. So the United Nations is focused on this. So we realize the importance of quality education. So we want to review what are those policies in developing nations? How effective have they been? Have they really contributed to the level of economic development of such nations? Vis-a-vis other developed countries. These are issues that we'll be looking at critically in this program series. On today's episode, we'll be answering some basic questions. What do we mean by macroeconomics? Are there basic, macroeconomic objectives that every government of a nation will seek to achieve? Okay, what is economic growth? What do we mean by that? When we say economic growth, what is the role of economic growth? How do you measure economic growth in a nation? And of course, some stylized facts about economic growth, comparing economic growth values of some countries and some continents. When you talk about economic growth, it's a concept that comes under what economists would term macroeconomics. And macroeconomics is actually a branch of economics that studies, the overall economic behavior of a nation. We are looking at aggregate output, aggregate employment. We are looking at aggregate balance of payment position of nations. You want to look at an economy. We talk about macroeconomy, totality. In every nation we have households, we have firms in various sectors. So you are looking at the totality of households behavior, totality of firms, totality of even sectors, industry. So when you talk about macroeconomics, we are looking at the overall behavior of an economy in totality. So why is it important? Every government of any country would seek to achieve stability in the economy. You want to see your economy grow in terms of what they produce, what you produce, what your people as individuals, as firms, what they produce in a nation. So you want to seek to achieve what we call macroeconomic objectives. And one of the things you want to achieve is economic growth. And that's what I said will be the starting point today, where we'll be discussing further. You want to achieve economic growth. You want to achieve, in fact, not just economic growth, you want stable and sustainable economic growth. Remember that I spoke about the sustainable development goals of even the United Nations. You want to achieve what we call price stability, and when there's price stability, definitely there'll be low level of inflationary pressure in the economy. As the government of a nation is where the central planning, depends on what you use, the federal government, the state, even the local government, as the case may be. You want to ensure that prices are relatively stable, because if prices are not stable, it's going to affect the standard of living of your citizens. And you want to speak to a lot of factors. You want to speak to your literacy rate. It's going to even affect the quality of life of your citizens. So every government of any nation wants to achieve this. You also want to achieve low level of unemployment. Now, it has been proven by various scholars that we always have what we call the natural rate of unemployment. It's natural because some people want to change their jobs. So between the time, for instance, I'm working with a consulting firm, I want to change to a fast-moving consumer goods firm. Now, the time I'm going to take for me to submit my application, go through the recruitment process, definitely I'm going to be out of job. But that kind of job is natural, because within a short time, I'm expected to be gainfully employed. So we're going to be looking at, every government wants to ensure, that low level, if you cannot rate it totally, very low level of unemployment rate in the economy, because it's going to speak to the income level of your people, and it's going to affect a lot of things as a nation. You want to also ensure that we have what we call equitable distribution of income, the gap between the rich and the poor. You want to bridge that gap. We don't want to have a lot of poor people in the economy, because we're going to speak again to the purchasing power. You're going to speak to the level of savings. And when people cannot save, you cannot invest. And when you cannot invest, you cannot produce as a nation. It's going to affect what you produce. You're going to speak to your balance of payment position. And another macroeconomic objective that any government in any nation will want to achieve is what we call equilibrium in its balance of payment, popularly known as BOP. We are looking at your receipt, what you want to export. You're looking at what you import. You want to ensure that you export more than you import, okay? Because it also has its demerits when you are strictly an import-driven economy. It has its implications when you depend so much on foreign goods. When even for your local manufacturers domiciled in your country, if they get at least 60-70% of their raw materials, okay, from other nations, it means that you are exposing yourself to what we call imported inflation. So if there is inflationary pressure in, for example, in Japan, and you're in another country, say in Ghana, your prices are stable, but when the prices of raw materials in Japan have increased, it's going to increase the cost of production for the local industries that are importing for Japan. That's what we call imported inflation. Even when your prices are relatively stable, you can import inflationary pressure from another country, transfer it to you, because you are solely dependent on imported raw materials. So for any nation who want to achieve that balance, that even if it's not what we call a balance of payment surplus, where you are exporting more than you import, you want to make sure that your level of export is at the same with your level of import. That's equitable. That's equilibrium balance of payment. Okay, now that I have spoken about the macroeconomic objective briefly, we can't go into details one after the other, but I said subsequent episode we're looking at each of these objectives, because these are also indicators of level of economic development in a particular country. Now, what do we mean by economic growth? Oxford Dictionary has described economic growth as the increase in the production of goods and services per head of population over a stated period of time, usually a year. So he has looked at it to say, what have they produced in a particular nation over a period of time, usually GDP, economic growth in a year, which is usually measured by GDP. Another definition is we are talking about the increase in the quantity and quality of economic goods and services that a nation produces. So this school of thought is saying, what have you produced as a nation? Now, it's not just in the quantity of goods and services that you have produced, but also the quality of goods and services. You can produce 1 million quantities, but has the quality improved over time? Or have you produced substandard goods, over time? So it's looking at the quality and the quantity of goods and services produced in a nation over a period of time, usually a year. McKinsey has described economic growth as how much an entity, such as a country, is increasing and improving the goods and services it produces. Now, from these various definitions that I've mentioned briefly, what is important to note is when we talk about economic growth, to say an economy is growing, is you are looking at the value of those goods and services that you have produced as a nation in a particular year. So, for instance, if I'm producing 5,000 or 5 million, bags of cement every day. So I'm multiplying that by 12. What have I produced in a year? I'm multiplying by. Remember, it is the monetary value. It is the monetary value of final goods and services that a nation produces over a period of time, usually a year. Monetary, because we have material value. So in this case, it's monetary. It speaks in terms of money value, monetary terms. What have I produced as a nation? 5,000 bags every day of cement, multiplying that by 12, and how much does it take to produce each bag? That is the value of what you are producing a year, and it's expected that you must achieve sustainable increase over time. So if what I produce, the value that I produce this year is about $10 million, I'm expected that next year I'm supposed to produce more. So how do you measure economic growth? If this is very particular and very important, there are various measures of economic growth, but one that is generally acceptable that a lot of people do deploy is what we call the gross domestic product. And as I mentioned earlier, the gross domestic product is the monetary value of final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. We have come across articles that talk about GDP, of the US as at 2023. You have GDP of China as at 2023. So gross domestic product is one of the measures of estimating how much an economy has grown, because it's going to show you the monetary value of everything that has been produced in that country at the particular over a given period of time, usually a year. And if you look at it in the US, economic growth is actually driven by consumer spending. And you know what inflation is as? When people spend more, this is the way it works. When people spend more, it means that when I'm spending more, it means we are demanding more goods in that particular economy, and because we are demanding more goods in that particular economy, definitely existing firms that you are purchasing more. So if I'm purchasing more of household items from a particular FMCG, maybe Cadbury, household items, beverages from them, because consumers are spending more, they are demanding more, expectedly Cadbury would increase production. And once they increase production, that's when I talk about you need more manpower, because it has increased, demand has increased by 40%. You are going to be, and we're talking about business expansion. So from a particular unit, you want to increase your plant size, you need human capital, you want to deploy, you need more capital. You can decide to approach the bank, for more money in terms of loan. It becomes an interest to those banks giving out the loan. Cadbury can decide to go to the capital market to say, look, what we need to do is to raise shares, sell our shares so you can raise more capital. See that expansion process. And what it does again is that it increases everything, and they want to employ more. The banks on that, so it leads to economic growth in the economy. Let's take another example, because we have talked about production, but what about the real estate? Okay, when people demand more homes, the drive to the property owners increases. It means that demand for homes will increase, and such those in the real estate, the firms, the property investors would also expand their business, to meet up with that demand. And once they're expanding the business, recall they're going to need more workers, more employers of labor, people that want to give their service to build across their various sites, and that also increases the income of individuals in the economy, and of course that leads to an increase in economic growth. And this is important because it's important to measure economic growth, because it's a strong indicator of the health status of an economy. It shows if an economy is healthy. It shows if an economy is improving. It shows if an economy, the standard of living of the citizens are on the rise. And how do you define this? It's usually depicted by the level of consumer spending, aggregate income, and investment in a nation or economy. And also note if there is also a decline, or stagnated growth in an economy. So if the economic growth in this year is about $1.1 trillion, and next year we have just about $1.14 trillion, it means that you have not grown. It's still around the same area. So how do you want to know if you are growing as an economy, if you are healthy, if your economic status is healthy, if you are not measuring? So as a nation, this speaks to what we measure. Now, there's been various people that have debunked the gross domestic product as the best measure of economic growth. Though traditionally this is considered as the best indicator of a country's economic growth, but there have been people, scholars, a lot of arguments, research have been ongoing to say that GDP is not the best measure. Okay, and why do we say that? Because that argument is that there are some transactions that are not adequately captured, in that value of GDP. What do I mean? Now, for developing nations, realize that there are some transactions that you do not even, you can't quantify readily in monetary terms. So let me give you an example. Now, I'm a mother and I'm not employing people to take care of my children. I take them to school and I bring them back. I've contributed. I have, done something of that service is valuable. But how can I monetize that service? Because my husband is not going to likely to pay me for taking the children to school and bringing them back. But ordinarily, if I want to capture, remember, GDP is talking about the monetary value of all goods and services. I have not been paid for that. Can it be adequately captured? Okay? Even lessons given to children. I'm a teacher. I teach my children after school. Am I going to be paid for that? Or I'm a secretary. I offer secretarial services to my husband. Is he going to pay me for that? If he does not pay me for that, how do you capture that in our GDP? Of course, even as a woman in a developing nation, you do the house chores yourself. You do the laundry, you take care of the cooking, you take care, of cleaning the house. How do you capture that in our GDP? Remember, you're supposed to capture all goods and services. So I've rendered services, childcare service, laundry service, the driving service as a cook, but these have not been adequately captured in the value of GDP, and that is one of the issues where some scholars have said GDP is not the best measure because it fails to capture some of these transactions. Okay, since GDP measures monetary value, okay, it's also important to note that environmental costs too are not adequately captured. There's no provision for that in GDP. Though, like I said, traditionally, what most countries do use to measure the level of economic growth is still the gross domestic product, popularly known as the GDP. Okay, now even when you produce, let me give you another example. When you produce for home use, okay, I've grown my cassava, I've turned it into my gari or cassava flakes, but I've grown it to be consumed at home. It's a non-market transaction. How can you capture that, okay, in the value of GDP for that particular, year? However, it still remains one of the best measures of measuring economic growth in a particular nation. It's very crucial to achieving better living conditions of the people. Now, it's so important that even the eighth goal, of the Sustainable Development Goals of the World Bank, the United Nations, is to promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. The 8th goal of the 16 Sustainable Development Goals, crafted out by the United Nations, is to promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. What do we mean by decent work? This is a situation where everyone in the economy gets work that is productive and has a fair income. The workplace is also safe and secure. It promotes social protection for families and their better prospects for personal development and social integration. So if you have any work that does not have all of these key points that I've mentioned, that kind of work is not qualified to be termed decent. Thank you so much for joining. If you are just joining us, for those who have joined at the beginning, it's still a new program series titled Policies and Economic Development. Thank you so much for joining. Okay, so there's another concept that I need to mention briefly, is what we call gross domestic product per capita. GDP per capita. Now I've told you that gross domestic product is the monetary value of final goods and services produced in a particular country. Now, when we look at the GDP per capita income per capita, is that you are looking at what you have produced, the value of what you have produced as a nation divided by the population. Okay, in that particular country, it's possible that for a particular country you could have produced about $230 trillion worth of goods and services. But how many people, how many people spend their time to produce that is important, because the GDP per capita speaks to each person, what has individuals in an economy contributed. And you see that is important because this speaks to the standard of living of the people. So you cannot talk about economic development without mentioning this key point, because sometimes if you look at just the GDP value, it will not give you the contextual meaning. You won't know, how effective a nation has been in deploying, their capital, their resources in their production process. So most times when we talk about economic development, when we talk about looking at the standard of living of people in a particular country, comparing two continents with each other, we look at the gross domestic per capita. We look at the we call the PCI, per capita income per person in a particular economy. It would show you the standard of living of people living in that country. Now, as you just go to some interesting statistics of economic growth. Now, I want to look at the value of GDP last year, 2023. So I'm going to be doing country versus continent comparison. Okay, last year, the GDP of the US was $27.36 trillion US dollars. Okay, that is a country. So I want to be looking at the GDP of Africa. The GDP of Africa for 2023 was 3.1 trillion USD. That is huge disparity, okay, huge gap between the GDP of the country, the US, versus the GDP of Africa. Well, remember when I mentioned earlier that we have in developed nations that most in some transactions are not properly captured. That's the truth. But be it as it may be, this is still huge. Okay, now we are talking about the country versus continent comparison. Let's look at state versus country. Okay, so I want to be comparing 3 states in the US, okay, versus a country in Africa, that is Nigeria. Okay, so California, we're looking at the 3 highest states with the highest GDP in the US. California last year made $3.8 trillion US dollars in terms of their GDP value. Texas made $2.56 trillion USD, and New York made $2.15 trillion. So let's come to Nigeria. Like I said, that's state versus country comparison. Nigeria made $1.115 trillion USD. Okay, though according to Nigeria Bureau of Statistics, our GDP grew in Nigeria by 3.46% year on year in real terms in the first quarter of 2023. Okay, that was a growth last year, but we made $1.15 trillion as a country, which is far less than that of California, a state in the US. Now, when you look at all of this, you understand that there are disparity, so there are lessons to learn from other nations that have gotten it well, because we are not even talking about economic development if you have not even achieved, economic growth in reality. In fact, looking at GDP per capita, I try to look at, some countries across the globe and look at the global ranking. And it was interesting that the poorest, according to IMF, the world poorest country is Burundi, okay, and the per capita income is $308, and you have a population of nearly 13 million. Okay, that's $308. We have that of Ghana as $2,585, Ghana $2,131, Kenya $2,259. Okay, and we have Cote d'Ivoire $2,497. But that's not even where I'm going. Okay, I looked at the richest countries around the world. Okay, in terms of their GDP capital, I saw Luxembourg $128,820. Okay, you can say the population of Luxembourg is not as much. What about Ireland? We have $106,998. We have Switzerland at $94,835. Okay, and I came back to look at the poorest countries. Okay, that is the 20 world's poorest countries, and what I discovered was very, very interesting is that 19 out of the 20 world's poorest countries are located on the African continent. 19 out of the 20 world's poorest countries, if you are looking at the per capita, GDP per capita, are located on the African continent. So it means that the poorest nations in the world, in terms of what we are producing, value of goods and services, looking at it with our population, are located on the African continent. So there are a lot of issues we need to look at. We need to go back to look at our policies. What have we gotten right? Is there a need to adapt, to review these policies? We need feedback from the people. Is there a gap between even recognizing the need of this policy? Is there a gap in implementation, or are we not even getting enough feedback from the people on the African continent? What are the real issues here, so that we can talk about the right policies that will put on the plane, on the pace of consistent economic development on African continent. It will be interesting to even consider policies from the richest countries that are found in Europe and North America. They are there, the richest. What have they gotten right in terms of their policies? Okay, these are things, issues that we'll be looking at. We are going to be unraveling them in order to come up with effective policy suggestions in this program series. Wow. On this note, I'd like to draw the curtain here. Thank you so much for staying tuned to the end of our maiden edition of our program series, Policies and Economic Development. We hope that you join us same time next Friday on Amorgate Radio Communication. For feedback, question, kindly send a mail to us at contact@theamorgate.org. And you can check us on our social media handles on Facebook, Amorgate, LinkedIn, Instagram, Amorgate. I remain your host, Titilola Ogunshono, saying bye from here.